Greetings and salutations to you, my most excellent of friends. My name is Skippy. I had the pleasure of being the tour guide for your kids last week at Vacation Bible School on the most epic of road trips, where we learned all about Jesus and a life and a journey that he has planned for us and all the pit stops along the way. Speaking of pit stops, I get to invite you to some cool stuff coming up at our church. So join us for our neighborhood block party on July 3rd. Grab an awesome hot dog, some Kona ice, and let the kiddos go bananas on the bounciest of bounce houses. It all starts Sunday, July 3rd at 10:45 a.m. Just as a reminder that even though we won't have an 11 a.m. service, our worship services remain the same for 8 and 9:30. See you there. Oh, it's free. So be a good neighbor and invite someone. Oh, we are excited about the upcoming Day for Hope. On July 30th, we will be hosting local businesses and agencies to bless 100 kids and their families who just need a little extra help. And we will also have the opportunity to share the gospel with them. What a great way to love on our community. But we need your help, dude, to make this day a success. Won't you join us Saturday, July 30th? Connect with Grace Goggin at the Welcome Desk this Sunday or visit hope.westby.org. Hey, Supper Summers return this week. Awesome, dude. Join us for food, fun, and fellowship. See what's cooking at menu.westby.org. It's just $5 for adults and $20 family max. Like, seriously, dude, feed your whole family for $20. Kids 5th grade and under eat for free, my man. Well, that's it for now, so let's worship together.
This life is a journey, a path made for me. With every step I take, as I run this race. This is the journey of a lifetime. The journey of a lifetime. God, you already know me. I wanna know you. Grow stronger and discover the truth. I'm ready, let's go. Where you lead, I'll follow. Where you lead, I'll go. Not gonna wait for tomorrow. This is the journey of a lifetime. With every step I take, with every step I take, I'm becoming the person you call me to be. A child of God, alive and redeemed. So I set my eyes on you. Jesus, I'm ready, let's go.
Jonah is unlike any other book in the Bible. It's about a prophet, but there is no prophecy recorded. So what is it about this book that makes it so different? Well, Jonah the prophet is not the hero. He's actually the villain. And if there's any hero other than God in the book, then it's probably the great fish that swallows Jonah. The fish is appointed by God to basically make Jonah a captive audience. The book is filled with irony, satire, humor, and foolishness. The book ends without an answer, and it leaves the reader hanging. The story remains incomplete for the reader's sake. And there's that question as we read an incomplete story. What will we do to complete the story? The book was probably not written by Jonah because it shows him in a negative light. So written anonymously as another take or another side on this so-called great prophet. So we're going to be talking about Jonah today. We're in our series about God's story from beginning to end, a series through the Bible. We're finishing out the prophets today. Jonah is not the last book of the Old Testament, but it will be the last prophet that we're looking at before we start moving into the New Testament. And what we're going to learn through Jonah's story is our responsibility to do God's mission that Jonah did not do very well. So let's read a little bit of Jonah. I'm going to tackle the entire first chapter. So get your Bibles out, open them up, turn them on. Let's read Jonah chapter 1 together. The Lord gave this message to Jonah, son of Amittai. Get up and go to the great city of Nineveh. Announce my judgment against it, because I have seen how wicked its people are. But Jonah got up and went in the opposite direction to get away from the Lord. He went down to the port of Joppa, where he found a ship leaving for Tarshish. He bought a ticket and went on board, hoping to escape from the Lord by sailing to Tarshish. But the Lord hurled a powerful wind over the sea, causing a violent storm that threatened to break the ship apart. Fearing for their lives, the desperate sailors shouted to their gods for help and threw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. But all this time Jonah was sound asleep down in the hold. So the captain went down after him. "How can you sleep at a time like this?" he shouted. "Get up and pray to your God. Maybe he will pay attention to us and spare our lives." Then the crew cast lots to see which of them had offended the gods and had caused the terrible storm. When they did this, the lots identified Jonah as the culprit. "Why has this awful storm come down on us?" they demanded. "Who are you? What is your line of work? What country are you from? What is your nationality?" Jonah answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land." The sailors were terrified when they heard this, for he had already told them he was running away from the Lord. "Oh, why did you do it?" they groaned. And since the storm was getting worse all the time, they asked him, "What should we do to you to stop this storm?" "Throw me into the sea," Jonah said. It will become calm again. I know that this terrible storm is all my fault." Instead, the sailors rowed even harder to get the ship to land. But the stormy sea was too violent for them, and they couldn't make it. Then they cried out to the Lord, Jonah's God. "O Lord," they pleaded, "don't make us die for this man's sin, and don't hold us responsible for his death. O Lord, you have sent this storm upon him for your own good reasons." Then the sailors picked Jonah up and threw him into the raging sea, and the storm stopped at once. The sailors were awestruck by the Lord's great power, and they offered him a sacrifice and vowed to serve him. Now the Lord had arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. So there's a lot more to this story. We'll get to that here in a second. The overarching theme of the book is how Israel has a responsibility to go to these neighboring nations to share God's word. And part of what we learn in the book of Jonah that's later fully revealed in the New Testament is how God's mission applies to everyone. God calls us outward to our neighborhoods. God calls us outward to the nations. And what happens with our own selfishness is that it pushes us inward towards ourselves. So Jonah is a book about what not to do. Jonah is in many ways the anti-missionary. He becomes a negative example of of being God's messenger. He's the opposite of who we should be. God's plan of redemption includes a selfless, outward movement of his people. And our sin pushes us inward towards selfishness and self-preservation. So this chapter, the first chapter, introduces us to a very important aspect of God. He has a mission for his people that extends beyond their own borders and their own prejudices. God has a mission for you to reach outward from yourself. In verse 1, it says that the Lord gave this message to Jonah. And I can imagine Jonah thinking, okay, all right, I'm a big prophet, well-known, successful. God's giving me another word. He's giving me another mission. Okay, God, what do you have to say? Well, Jonah was an extremely successful prophet. In fact, in 2 Kings chapter 14, we learned where he carried out God's message to extend the territories for King Jeroboam. So I know he's getting excited about what his next mission will be. And then God tells him, go to the great city of Nineveh, announce my judgment against it. And I just see Jonah just like going pale, saying, oh, great. Nineveh? I don't want to go to Nineveh. Now, why would Jonah not want to go to Nineveh? What was the great city of Nineveh like? It was totally wicked. It was violent. It was the enemy of Israel. They would flay their enemies. They would tear lips off the faces of those that they were fighting against. They would tear limbs apart. They made great piles of skulls as trophies. I mean, a violent, sick way of living. And Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. And the Assyrians were part of who conquered Israel. So this is their enemy. And so Jonah says in verse 3, and paraphrasing a little bit here, nope, no way. No way, God, I'm not going. But Jonah isn't fleeing because he's scared of Nineveh. You can understand that, but he's not. He runs because he doesn't think that they deserve to be saved. And we learn his motive later on in the story in chapter 4, verse 2, where Jonah complains to the Lord. And he says, didn't I say before I left home that you would do this, Lord? So, spoiler alert, God ultimately saved Nineveh. And then we learned why he ran away. That is why I ran away to Tarshish. I knew that you are a merciful and compassionate God, slow to get angry and filled with unfailing love. You are eager to turn back from destroying people. So Jonah knew that if Nineveh repented, if they actually followed through, then God would spare them. He didn't want them to be saved because they are his enemies. So Jonah makes a conscious decision to turn from living his life for God. He turns away. Now, it says here in the text that he tried to run away from God. You can't really run away from the Lord's presence, but we can distance ourselves spiritually. You can't run from God spatially because he's everywhere, but you can run from God relationally. And that's exactly what Jonah is doing. You lose yourself when you make yourself the priority. Jonah thought too highly of himself, so God hurled a violent storm to get his attention. And as we just read in chapter 1, the experienced sailors on board know that this is not a normal storm. It's not a natural storm. This is something supernatural. And Jonah, it's just ingrained in self-pity. You see this downward descent in chapter 1, where Jonah gets deeper and deeper and deeper into himself. So he flees, then he goes down into the boat. Then not only is he down in the boat, he's falling asleep. Then he gets thrown over into the sea, and then he thinks he's going to die before the fish swallows him. So you see this downward descent. The story arc here is a downward descent of Jonah. You will never find the real you if you're looking within. Jonah kept thinking of himself instead of thinking about the mission of God. And just think about the boat. Jonah had a mission field all around him. I mean, this is a polytheistic crew. They believe in many gods. That comes out into the text. So They're just praying to the gods. And here Jonah has a chance to show them who the one true God is. And he's apathetic to the sailors. He could have snapped out of it in that moment, in the storm, and said, I got to turn back to God and let me tell you about him. But he doesn't do that. And so we even see a stark contrast here between Jonah and the captain of the ship. This is a heathen unbeliever. And the heathen is pleading for spiritual action, where Jonah, the believer, is sleeping apathetically. Jonah made himself the priority, and he lost himself in the process. And what storms will do, storms will remind you that God's love is found beneath the waves. Now let me explain. Why the storm? Why does God hurl the storm? Because God wants Jonah back. And notice in verse 8 that the sailors ask Jonah what they ask him. They ask an identifying question in verse 8. Who are you? And we get, these are rather strange questions in such a violent storm, but actually it's the right ones to ask. And in verse 9, Jonah speaks for the first time in the story, and he says, I serve the one true God who made all, even this ocean. And you can imagine the sailors, verse 10, man, you're crazy. Okay, so you believe in the God, there's one God, the God, and you're running from him? That's foolishness. The irony here is that the sailors notice the foolishness of Jonah's actions, yet he does not. Jonah is a very complicated individual with complicated motives, and really this is all of us. In verse 12, he asks to be thrown back into the sea of God's wrath. And Jonah's not really speaking out of self-sacrifice here for the sailors, but he's really speaking from a place of self-pity. You know, if he was all about saving the sailors, he'd have just jumped into the sea himself. He's speaking from a place of self-pity. The key here is that the only way Jonah was going to drown is if he stayed on that boat and kept running from God. God is in hot pursuit of this prophet who is running away. And he catches up to him. He catches up to Jonah in the belly of a great fish. Now, what we see in the next chapter, in chapter 2, is Jonah praying. And prayer helps you realize the depth of God's grace. All of chapter 2 is a prayer, and it begins, God, can you hear me now? I cried out to the Lord. Remember, he's in the sea, drowning, and then he's in the belly of a fish. And God listens to prayer, even from the strangest of places, like the belly of a fish. People ask, does God hear my prayers? I believe he does, even from what I believe are distant places. Of course, God is everywhere. The fish is the mode of deliverance, not the cause of distress. So if you look at chapter 1, God hurled the storm, that's verse 4. God arranged the fish, verse 17. God was responsible for the distress and the deliverance. He does both. How does God deliver? In this case, he delivers through prayer. Jonah cries out, it says at the beginning of chapter 2, help! God says, sure, okay. Then a fish swallows Jonah. Jonah's like, I didn't see that coming. God overcomes through prayer. Jonah says in verse 3 of chapter 2, it was you who did this. You threw me into the ocean depths. I was buried beneath your wild and stormy waves. God did this. A powerful prayer rests in God's sovereignty and trusts in his grace. And God here rescues through prayer. Jonah chapter 2, verse 6 has one of those great but God verses. So we see that here. I was imprisoned. The gates were locking shut forever. This is him drowning. But you, O Lord my God, snatched me from the jaws of death. God, you did this. Great but God verse. God's the one who saved him. He caused the distress, yes, but he also gave the mode of deliverance. And then in verse 10, it's one of these verses that It's just a great verse. It's not many people who take chapter 2, verse 10 as their life verse. Then the Lord ordered the fish to spit Jonah out onto the beach. The Hebrew there is vomit. So, it's typically not something that people would latch onto. It's a very dramatic exit for this prophet. Let me just put it that way. And when God rescues, it's not always clean. It's not always neat. It's not always tidy. Sometimes God redeems by covering you in fish vomit. That's how God works sometimes. Sometimes it's just messy. Now, Jonah's got to go to Nineveh. Would this moment become a turning point for the prophet? Would Jonah's salvation turn into a desire to see his enemies saved? Well, obedience to God is more than reluctant compliance. Jonah complies reluctantly, but obedience to God is deeper, and Jonah's about to learn this lesson too. And if you look at the beginning of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 1, just go ahead and make that comparison. Take a moment and make that comparison. Look at Jonah 3, verses 1 and 2, and look at Jonah 1, verses 1 and 2. They're the same thing. God's command hadn't changed. It's the same verse. It's exactly the same. Get up and go to Nineveh. Had Jonah's heart changed is the real question. God had not changed. His command had not changed. Well, Jonah offers reluctant compliance. And the reason that we know this in part is because of verse 4 in chapter 3, where Jonah preaches to the people. And I realize I may not be the world's best preacher. In fact, I know I'm not. But as bad as my sermons may be, there's always one worse, and I can always go to Jonah chapter 3, verse 4, and say, at least I don't preach like Jonah, because Jonah 3, verse 4 contains the world's worst sermon ever preached. Here it is, 5 words in the Hebrew. You're all gonna die. That's the lesson here. Jonah reluctantly walks into Nineveh, and he says, 40 days from now, Nineveh will be destroyed. He goes to his enemies, he walks into the city, you're all gonna die. Now what happens? Believe it or not, God works a miracle. The entire city repents, including the king. Nineveh experiences God's salvation despite Jonah. There's no reason for this revival except for the power of God. Don't give God your minimum like Jonah. Give God your everything. Jesus saved you eternally. Don't serve begrudgingly. Why? Well, God's love is more important and more powerful than your wrath. At the end of chapter 3, an entire city is saved. Mission accomplished. Jonah wasn't the greatest missionary, but mission accomplished. And why not conclude the story right here? Nineveh has a revival. Maybe Jonah realizes a lesson, but that's not what happens. Well, God had to deal with Jonah. He dealt with Nineveh. Now he's going to deal with Jonah. Look at how chapter 3 ends and how chapter 4 begins. When God saw what they had done and how they had put a stop to their evil ways, he changed his mind and did not carry out the destruction he had threatened. This change of plans greatly upset Jonah, and he became very angry. You see, God turned from his anger, and Jonah turned to his anger. And Jonah in essence is telling God right here, God, you should be angry like me. And God is saying, no, Jonah, you should learn to love like me. In Jonah chapter 4, verse 4, we see the Lord's reply. Is it right for you to be angry like this? Jonah, really? Is this what you're going to do? Is this really right? It's like asking a child, do you really want to behave this way? God loved Jonah's most hated enemy, and it bothered Jonah. So Jonah just leaves the city. He's exhausted, he's overstimulated, he's drained. And Jonah goes out there on the outskirts of the city, likely sitting because of the climate. He's likely sitting in like 110-degree heat, looking at the city from a distance. He's just pouting. And then In verse 6 of chapter 4, God provides a plant or a vine, depending on your translation, to grow up over Jonah for his comfort. And Jonah's response is literally in the Hebrew. It says, he rejoiced over the vine with great rejoicing. I mean, this guy is ecstatic over a plant. And it's the first time in this entire book that Jonah is happy. This same joy didn't come after being rescued from the storm or the fish or even the salvation of an entire city. The state of ecstasy comes from a plant, which is meaningless and points to Jonah's selfishness. Jonah was all about self-preservation, what he wanted, not what God wanted. Now, what did God do to Jonah because of his attitude? God destroyed the plant, sent a scorching heat, and made Jonah's life miserable. Of all of the talk of destruction in this book, the only thing that God destroys is the plant, the trivial plant. But it's the one thing Jonah had become attached to. Jonah was more concerned about physical comfort than he was the salvation of thousands of Ninevites. Self-preservation over salvation. That's Jonah. We have no right to demand that God favor us over someone else. So God asks Jonah again, is it right for you to be angry? Jonah replies, yeah, I'm angry enough to die. He would rather die than see his enemy saved. This is the opposite of Christ's perspective. Jesus died to save his enemies. The story ends with God telling Jonah that the plant was ultimately nothing. You care for something that is ultimately nothing. And then God asks Jonah, if you can fall in love with a plant, why can't you have the same love for the lost people of Nineveh? The book ends abruptly with a question from God. Shouldn't I feel sorry for such a great city? How did Jonah answer this question? We don't know. We don't have the end of the story. We do not know if Jonah changed his heart or not. What's the point of this ending? In the Bible, when a story ends with an open question like Jonah, what God is telling you is that you are to complete the story. Jonah reveals our responsibility in God's story to share his salvation. So church, West Bradenton, how do you answer that question? How are you going to complete the story? You can. It's part of the mission of God. But remember, the story is not about you, even if the story is for you. The story is ultimately about our Savior, Jesus Christ.